The Naples Central School District is a small rural school district in Ontario County, New York. It has 9 bus routes. Those routes average 65 to 80 miles round trip. Each of the 9 routes are uphill. It's the kind of school district that exists across rural America. Not wealthy, not politically connected, not the kind of place that gets mentioned in Albany budget negotiations, except as a line item. The kind of place where the superintendent's job is to stretch every dollar as far as it'll go, because the taxpayers funding the district are working people who notice when their tax bills go up. 2 years ago, Naples Central School District received federal grant money to purchase 2 electric buses and the infrastructure to charge them. The grant covers the purchase. The district's transportation director and head mechanic, Pat Elwell, who himself is an electric vehicle owner, whose wife drives one too, who came into this with no ideological axe to grind, has been tracking the data ever since. He is, as he told me, data-driven. He wanted to know what the buses actually cost to run. The data came back. Diesel costs 36 cents per mile. Electric costs $3.18 per mile. That's not a rounding error. That's not a measurement anomaly. That is 9 times more expensive to run an electric bus than a diesel bus. Documented over 2 school years in a real district with real routes, and the real transportation director who owns an electric car and has no reason to want the answer to come out the way it did. New York State is mandating that every school district in the state transition to all-electric bus fleets by 2035. There are approximately 50,000 school buses in New York State. The state has set aside $400 to $500 million in grant money to help with the transition. The superintendent of Naples Central School District did the math. That grant money covers somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 buses. 48,000 buses are unfunded. At a $300,000 cost differential per bus over diesel, you can do the math yourself.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
The Naples Central School District story matters for a specific reason that goes beyond one small district's budget headache. It's the 2-year documented real-world operational data on electric school buses in exactly the kind of environment, rural, hilly, cold weather, that covers most of New York State outside the 5 boroughs and a handful of suburban counties. It's the kind of data that policy decisions of this magnitude should be built on before mandates are issued, not discovered after the mandate is already law and the compliance deadline is approaching. Patrick Elwell ran the electric buses on every route the district operates to establish a baseline. He wanted to know how they would perform across the full range of conditions the district's terrain and climate actually produce. What he found is that the buses perform well in a specific temperature window between 20 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and that performance degrades significantly outside that window. In cold weather, the batteries lose charge rapidly, and the heating system draws power that would otherwise go to propulsion. Elwell told me that during the cold mornings, the district was spending approximately 20% of its battery capacity just getting heat into buses before they could be put on the road. That left insufficient charge to complete afternoon routes. requiring midday charging that added operational complexity and cost. This past winter, which Superintendent Kevin Schwartz described as more typical winter than the previous year's abnormal temperatures, the electric buses were on the road approximately 50% of the time. The other 50% of the school days, Elwell made a call to run diesel instead because he was not willing to put the children and staff on a bus where they could see their breath and the windows were frosted over. That is not an ideological statement about electric vehicles. That is a transportation director doing his job, making the safety call that the conditions required, using the diesel backup that is still available because the mandate has not yet forced the district to eliminate it. The cost differential is the number that should be in every Albany legislator's briefing bracket. 36 cents per mile for diesel, stable and predictable because the district can purchase diesel through state contracts at locked-in pricing. $3.18 per mile for electric. Variable and unpredictable because the per kilowatt hour cost of electricity fluctuates with supply charges, delivery charges, and the various other components of the utility bill that change month to month. The electric cost is not just higher, it's 9 times higher and impossible to budget reliably because it moves around in ways that diesel does not. For a district trying to be fiscally responsible to its taxpayers, that unpredictability is as much a problem as the absolute cost level. Schwartz laid out the statewide math with the clarity that comes from someone who has been doing this calculation for his own district and extrapolated it in the mandate's full scope. $400 to $500 million in state grant money, divided by $300,000 cost differential per bus, covers 1,600 to 2,000 buses, 50,000 buses in the state, 48,000 buses unfunded by the grants, each costing $300,000 more than diesel bus that it replaces, to be paid by community taxpayers across the state before infrastructure, before the electrical grid upgrades that would be required to charge fleets of electric buses at schools across New York, before the ongoing operational cost differential of $3.18 per mile versus 36 cents every school day for the life of the fleet. The cost math is the most visible problem with New York's electric bus mandate. The grid problem may be the more fundamental one, and it is receiving almost no attention in the policy debate around the mandate. Patrick Elwell and Superintendent Schwartz both raised the grid capacity issue directly in their conversation with me. The district currently has enough grid capacity to add one more level 2 charger. 1. Ontario County has communicated to districts in the region that there is a significant challenge on the electric grid across the area. The utility serving Naples Central School District, NYSEG, has confirmed the grid constraint. The district that received federal grant money to purchase 2 electric buses and build the infrastructure to charge them is already at or near the limit of what its grid connection can support, with 2 buses, not 9, 2. Schwartz estimated that if Naples Central School District were to convert its entire fleet to electric and build the charging infrastructure to support that fleet, the infrastructure cost alone would run approximately $1 to $1.5 million in electrical upgrades to bring sufficient power to the campus. That estimate is for a relatively small district. Scale that to the larger districts, the suburban and urban districts with fleets of 50, 100, 200 buses, and the infrastructure cost becomes a number that makes the per bus cost differential look manageable by comparison. The grid capacity problem is not unique to rural Ontario County. It's a systemic feature of the electrical infrastructure that the United States built over the past century, which was designed around a demand profile that did not include the simultaneous charging of large battery systems at thousands of locations across the state. Every electric vehicle mandate for school buses, for personal vehicles, for commercial fleets adds to the aggregate demand on a grid that was not designed for it and that cannot be upgraded at the speed the mandate assumes. The timeline for building new transmission capacity, upgrading local distribution infrastructure, and expanding generation capacity to meet the incremental demand from electrification mandates is measured in decades and billions of dollars, not in years and hundreds of millions that the state's mandate timeline assumes. The electricity that charges those batteries has to come from somewhere. This connects directly to the zero emissions claim that New York State uses to justify the mandate. The claim that electric buses produce no emissions, and therefore their adoption reduces the environmental impact of the school transportation system. That claim is false, and it's false in ways that the people making it know or should know. New York's electrical grid is not powered by renewable energy alone. It's powered by a mix of sources that includes natural gas, nuclear, hydroelectric, and growing but still minority shares of wind and solar. When an electric bus charges overnight at a school in Naples, New York, the electricity flowing into its battery comes from whatever the grid is producing at that hour, which on a cold winter night is predominantly natural gas and nuclear. The bus produces no tailpipe emissions. The power plant producing the electricity it runs on does. The emissions have not been eliminated. They have been moved upstream and averaged across the grid's generation mix, which makes them less visible, but does not make them zero. Marketing language around electric vehicles, zero emissions, clean energy, green transportation is one of the most successful examples of misdirection in the history of environmental policy, and it has been so thoroughly absorbed into public discourse that challenging it is treated as science denial rather than the basic demand for honest accounting that it actually is. An electric vehicle produces zero tailpipe emissions. That is true. It is also the least important part of the vehicle's total environmental impact, and the progressive policy establishment has made zero tailpipe emissions the only metric that counts in public discussion, because it is the only metric on which electric vehicles looks unambiguously better than their internal combustion counterparts. Look at the fuel life cycle, and the picture is more complicated. The lithium-ion batteries that power electric buses and electric vehicles are manufactured from materials lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and these are extracted through mining operations whose environmental impact is substantially and largely invisible to the American consumer. Lithium mining in South America is stripping ecosystems and depleting water tables in some of the most ecologically sensitive regions on the planet. Cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo operates under conditions that environmental and human rights organizations have documented extensively, conditions that would not be permitted under American environmental or labor law. The carbon footprint of manufacturing a large lithium-ion battery pack, the kind that powers a school bus, not just a passenger car, is significant, requiring a substantial number of miles of operation before the vehicle's lifetime emissions balance even reaches parity with a diesel equivalent, let alone improves on it. A cold weather environment where the battery operates at 50% efficiency for half the winter, that break-even point may never be reached. The battery disposal problem is one that the zero emissions framing most deliberately obscures. A lithium-ion battery pack does not break down naturally. It's not biodegradable. It contains materials that are toxic if they leach into soil or water, that require specific energy-intensive recycling processes to recover safely. The recycling infrastructure for large format lithium-ion batteries, the kind used in electric buses, is not currently adequate to handle the volume that a full fleet transition would generate. The batteries that are not recycled through proper channels because the recycling infrastructure is insufficient, because the economics of recycling do not always justify the cost, because the mandate is creating fleet transitions faster than the recycling capacity can expand, will be disposed of in ways that create the long-term environmental liabilities that the zero emissions framing was designed to make invisible. The long-term effects of the large-scale lithium-ion battery disposal on soil and groundwater are not fully understood because the technology is too recent and the scale of deployment is still too new for the longitudinal environmental data to exist. That's not a reason to proceed as though the effects are benign. It's a reason for the kind of precautionary approach that the environmental movement claims to support, except when the precaution would slow the adoption of a technology that the progressive policy agenda has committed to. The honest environmental accounting of electric bus mandates includes the mining impacts, the manufacturing emissions, the grid generation mix, the battery disposal liabilities, and the infrastructure construction costs. The zero emission claim accounts for none of those things. It counts only the tailpipe and calls the rest progress. Patrick Elwell, the electric vehicle owner and data-driven transportation director in Naples, New York, is not making an ideological argument. He is reporting what his instruments show. $3.18 per mile. 50% operational availability in a typical winter, one additional level 2 charger before the grid is at capacity. These are measurements, not opinions. The mandate that will require his district to replace its entire diesel fleet with vehicles that cost 9 times more per mile to operate and are unavailable half the winter is not based on measurements from districts like his. It's based on the ideological commitment of the Albany progressive establishment to a technology that works well in the marketing materials and less well on uphill routes in Ontario County in January. New York State's zero-emission school bus mandate is not a voluntary program. It's a legal requirement with a compliance deadline. Starting in 2027, all new bus purchases must be electric. The full fleet transition must be complete by 2035. After significant outcry from rural districts about the cost, the availability of power, and the battery performance issues in cold weather. Exactly the issues that Naples Central School District's 2 years of data document. The state allowed districts to apply for a 2-year extension. That accommodation does not change the mandate. It moves the compliance deadline slightly. Well, the fundamental economic and infrastructure problems remain unresolved. The state's response to the cost concern is the grant problem. $400 to $500 million available to help districts transition. Schwartz calculation makes clear what that grant program actually covers. 1,600 to 2,000 buses out of a statewide fleet of 50,000. The gap between the grant coverage and the mandate scope is not a funding detail to be resolved in the next budget cycle. It's a structural feature of a policy that was designed around a political commitment rather than a cost analysis. The commitment is to zero tailpipe emissions by 2035. The cost analysis, had it been done honestly before the mandate was issued, would have shown that the grant funding covers approximately 4% of the cost differential the mandate imposes on New York school districts. The 48,000 buses that the grants do not cover will be paid for by local property taxpayers. The infrastructure upgrades, the electrical grid work, the campus charging systems, the utility upgrades that NYSEG cannot currently commit to providing in Ontario County will be paid for by local property taxpayers. The ongoing operational cost differential, the gap between the 36 cents per mile and the $3.18 per mile, multiplied by every school day for the life of the fleet, will be paid by local property taxpayers, not by the Albany legislator who passed the mandate, not by the environmental advocacy organizations that lobbied for it, not by the federal agencies that provided the initial grant funding for pilot programs like Naples Central School District's 2 buses, by the working people who own property in Naples and Hermantown and every other rural school district in New York State that has uphill routes and cold winters and a grid that cannot currently support the fleet transition the state is requiring. The districts that are in the best position to absorb these costs are the wealthy suburban districts with large tax bases, proximity to urban grid infrastructure with greater capacity, flatter terrain, and the administrative resources to navigate the grant application process that partially offset the transition costs. The districts that are least able to absorb these costs are exactly the rural districts that the mandate's real-world data comes from. Districts like Naples, where the terrain is hilly, the winters are cold, the grid is constrained, the tax base is limited, and the superintendent is trying to explain to his community why the state is requiring to purchase buses that cost 9 times more per mile to operate and cannot reliably complete their routes in January. This is the pattern that this show is documented across multiple episodes of New York State's governing philosophy. Mandates issued from Albany that reflect the ideological commitments of the progressive legislative majority, whose cost falls most heavily on the rural and working class communities that are least represented in the coalition that passed the mandate, and least able to absorb the financial consequences of being wrong. The Clean Slate Act, the Green Light Law, Proposition 1, congestion pricing, and now the electric bus mandate. 50,000 buses, 48,000 of them are unfunded, $3.18 per mile, half the winter sitting in the garage because the battery cannot handle a typical Ontario County January. Patrick Elwell owns an electric car. He came to this data with no axe to grind. He ran the electric buses on every route, in every condition, for 2 full school years, because he is data-driven and he wanted to know the truth. The truth is $3.18 per mile versus 36 cents. The truth is 50% availability in a typical winter. The truth is one more level 2 charger before the grid is at capacity for a district that has 2 electric buses and is being mandated to eventually replace all 9 of its diesel routes. New York State calls this a zero-emission mandate. The electricity charging those buses comes from a grid that runs on natural gas and nuclear. The batteries are built from mined materials whose extraction leaves its own environmental footprint. The spent batteries do not break down naturally and must be recycled through processes whose infrastructure does not currently exist at the scale the mandate would require. The emissions have not been eliminated. They have been relocated, averaged across the generation mix, and rendered invisible by a marketing term that the state has embedded in law. 48,000 school buses, $300,000 more per bus than diesel. $1 to $1.5 million in infrastructure upgrades for a small district alone. A grid that Ontario County is already flagged as challenged for the current level of demand. A grant program that covers 4% of the mandate's cost, and a compliance deadline in 2035 that does not move regardless of whether the technology, the grid, or the economics get to where Albany says they need to be. The children riding school buses in Naples, New York, did not vote for this mandate. Their parents, who will pay for it in property taxes, did not design it. The superintendent, trying to be fiscally responsible to his community, did not ask for it. Albany issued it, and the bill will come due in communities like Naples, while the legislators who passed it will be running for their next office on their environmental record. We are going to keep reporting on this. We are not letting go. Stand with us, support the mission, refuse the silence. Find us at TITDUSA.com in the Stand Against the Silence campaign, and I'll see you next time.